Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the gold medal match between Steve Chaney and Ben Akrigg at Clash for the Cash 2025. Now, the reason I'm going over this isn't just the fact that I got some new footage from Chair Jordan on YouTube that doesn't have the flickering of my footage, but also because this was a really high-level fight between two top-level fencers that had a lot of really interesting and applicable technique. Now, the fight itself was, at least according to the score, a little one-sided in the favor of Steve Chaney, but there's still a lot to learn from as far as the adaptations that were attempted to be made by Ben. So, without any more talking, let's watch the fight. So our first exchange actually has a little bit of a wonky end to the footage, but the important thing is still within frame, and the important thing is the final little flurry of blows that happens towards the end. Now, the first thing to point out is that this exchange happens very, very quickly, and it's really hard to spot and understand even when you do have good footage or you were standing right there. But what happens here when we watch the slow-mo is essentially Steve raises up his sword to throw a kind of feint that looked like it was supposed to look like it was going high and then went a little bit mid. At the exact same time as Steve is throwing this feint, Ben simply snipes him in the hands and starts to back up. However, Chaney, realizing that he is no longer able to feint to the different place that he was going to go to, or that he is simply executing the preconceived technique that he was going to do anyway, proceeds to follow up with an after blow to the head. But this entire sequence happens in the span of like less than a half a second. And as a result, the judges miss about half of it. Now, normally I don't really talk about what judges miss or don't miss, but when you watch this, you can pretty easily understand why certain things were missed. It's really hard to get a sense of tempo when another thing's happening that quick. But what we're talking about here particularly is how we would judge this as Olympic fencing. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I think it brings up a really interesting application of what a lot of people refer to as the Olympic fencing technique wheel. I'm not going to pull it up because I don't think it's particularly helpful. But one of the interesting aspects of this is that it tells you that a straight attack is a good counter to a feint. And we can see that happening here. When Chaney goes up and he goes to perform his feint, we don't really know whether or not that was a feint or not. Perhaps he was intending to attack but simply pulled short. Regardless, any attack that does not fully commit is going to be referred to as a feint, not simply because it's an accurate way to represent it, because it's an accurate description of it in terms of what you should do to counter it. You should be countering feints with direct attacks, and that's exactly what Ben does here. The second he sees that feint, and the second he realizes it's not coming for his head, he throws out that hand snipe and lands it. But at the exact same time here, one of the best counters to direct attacks is a parry riposte. And the thing about Olympic fencing, as it differs from HEMA, is that HEMA has afterblows. It's entirely possible in many tournaments, and including this one, to always get the points that you land, regardless of whether or not you landed them first, or whether or not you had priority. As a result, whenever you get hit in the hands, it is a very good idea to full send an attack towards the head afterwards. Why? Because when someone hits you on the hands, their hands are going to be low in a position where their head is likely undefended. And one of the great things about HEMA afterblows is that you have this opportunity to punish what would otherwise be unpunishable in the world of Olympic fencing. And that's exactly what Stephen Chaney does here. He gets hit in the hands. He says, okay, I got hit. It's going to happen. There's something I can do about it, though. And he immediately sends towards the head. And as a result, Ben, who has been stopped by Stephen Chaney's hands, is unable to get his sword up fast enough to defend his head in the afterblow, resulting in a 2-1 exchange. Though, again, that's not what the judges saw and not what the judges called, I still think it's important to understand and acknowledge exactly what happened here in reality. Now, this second exchange is another really quick one, and another one at first glance doesn't seem particularly interesting until you put it into the context of the previous exchange. What I was talking about last time is this idea that Ben is looking for the feints that Stephen Chaney throws so that he can hand snipe him. And in this exchange, you see the exact same setup happen, although it's very subtle and it's very quick. Stephen Chaney is walking forward into range, and he has his couched Shield ready to go. However, he gestures forward with his hands in what is, again, we're going to refer to as a feint, regardless of what the intention actually was. And at this exact same moment, you see Ben go for another hand snipe. However, Chaney had the preconceived notion that this might happen and already had his game plan in play. He feinted his hands forward. He waited for that hand strike to come out. He pulled his hands back to his chest to ensure that there was no target to hit, and then capitalized on that opening, a missed hand shot, to throw the Shield that he was feinting just a second ago. He does manage to land that Shield straight to the top of the head, but at the exact same time that this is happening, Ben, who is still trying to find out where these feints really are and where they're committed, throws a kind of Zornhau of his own, or just a basic Oberhau, that does manage to get in onto the side of Cheney's left side of his head. Now, at the end of the day, this exchange is basically just a double, but if we think about it from the terms of Olympic fencing, there is a very interesting interaction going on here, which is that Stephen Cheney is baiting out an attack and then throwing a remise in order to capitalize on the fact that in order to get priority, again, in an Olympic fencing scenario, you have to try to parry. And while we're not using Olympic fencing priority, there is still an understanding that for most people, when they have thrown an attack and they have missed, they are now going to be in a defensive mindset and they are going to try their best to parry. They know that something is probably coming and they want to stop it. And as a result, the Shield that Stephen Cheney throws when he realizes he has created this opening is one designed to get around a parry. You can pretty easily imagine a situation here where instead of going for an Oberhau, Ben simply threw his Kron into the air in order to try to protect his head. He would have had to travel quite a distance to make it there, and it's entirely possible that even if he had fully committed to a parry, he wouldn't have been able to make it there in time. That is the application of technique that we are seeing here, and although it doesn't have the benefit of getting priority in an Olympic fencing format, it does still derive a lot of its technical and basically feedback loop-based decision-making from that Olympic fencing style of decision-making and wheel. So our next exchange is short and quick, and I'm just going to be honest here, most of them are going to be short and quick, but we see another little adaptation to the feedback loop that we've been trying to figure out throughout these last two exchanges, specifically the kind of feedback loop that Ben has been trying to figure out. Now in this exchange, we don't necessarily have the same kind of push and pull or the feints. Instead, what we have is an adaptation on the side of Ben in his attempt to try to deal with the onsetting Shield that he's been getting hit with so far. Now, he's obviously clearly aware that this is one of Cheney's favorite moves, and he's obviously very aware that his previous attempts to parry it or get around it have not been successful. So instead of simply going for the hands and looking for the feints like he does before, he's still looking for the feints, he's still looking for that lack of commitment, but what he is looking for is he's going to throw a completely different kind of technique that hopefully does a much better job of dealing with that Shield over the top. And what he throws is, again, what I'm just going to call a right side Zornhau. I have described Ben as loving the Zornhau before, and some people will disagree with me as to whether or not that is really a Zorn at all, but in my opinion, the intention of this technique was that if Cheney had come through with his Shield as Ben clearly thought he was going to, he would have crossed the line horizontally right across the level of his face and attempted to either hit the head, if Cheney had gone in really deep, or at the very least the arm, which is what he appeared to hit here. Now, in my opinion, one of the only reasons that Ben really lands this hand shot is because the flexibility of his fetter kind of combined with the upward-downward motion of his blade to kind of bend his tip down a little bit, which just kind of scraped the top of the hand. At the exact same time as that's happening, Cheney has feinted his Shield simply pulled around and thrown a left kind of middle cut towards the hip of Ben, which does eventually land. Now, at the end of the day, this is just a simultaneous arm hit and body hit, which under this rule set were both 1 point. But it is still worth pointing out that we are now 3 or 4 layers deep into the adaptations here, where both fencer has never done the same thing twice, but both of them have been trying to adapt to what they think is going to come next and been wrong almost every single time. This is the kind of interactions that you get in high-level fencing, where both people are trying to stay one step ahead of their opponent, but as such, end up almost being one step ahead of themselves, where the exchanges don't necessarily look so clean or so pretty, but the reason they're not is because both fencers are trying to get the right amount of forward thinking without necessarily going 3 or 4 steps ahead and resulting in an exchange like this, where they both just hit each other. So this next exchange is a really, really interesting one because it showcases a little bit of that 4D chess that I've been talking about earlier. Namely, the idea that both of these fencers are trying to come up with the next good application and adaptation without necessarily just reacting to whatever just happened to them. As we've seen up till now, both of these fencers have refused to do the same thing twice in a row, and when they have, arguably on the side of Ben, it hasn't really worked out for them. So now, in this interaction, we see two completely unique situations that are clearly an adaptation to the previous exchanges, but also a completely new situation that hadn't come up till now. What happens here is that Cheney is inching forward, just as he always does, and Ben decides that he is going to try to capitalize on the opening of Cheney's guard. Cheney, as we can point out here, likes to couch his sword on his right shoulder, which leaves his left shoulder open to some attack. If you get attacked on your left shoulder and you're couching this guard, the thing that you have to do essentially is simply move from one side to the other. But that can take some time. And what Ben chooses as his technique to seize this opening is a flicking Shielhao flat thrust. Now, what I mean by that is that Ben is sitting down here in a low guard, a kind of low plow, but his thumb is on top of the blade, which means that his sword is basically in a flat alignment to up and down cuts. So he pulls his sword up into a little bit of a cron and then flicks that tip in. And the reason this can work is that the flexibility of our fetters allows you to get a U-shaped bend in your sword, which can be very, very beneficial for getting around the parry of anyone who tries to go down to up, which is a very common parry to throw when you think something is coming downwards at your head or your shoulders. So he tries to throw this flicking Shielhao, but it doesn't quite work. And part of the reason it doesn't work is because Cheney's parry here is going from left to right, not down to up. If he had gone from down to up, he probably would have had a better chance at landing that Shielhao, but that was not the guard that Cheney had. So in my opinion, it wasn't exactly the best use of a tool for this particular situation, but at the same time, it does look like it gets very, very close to landing, but it does not. Now, the other interesting thing here is that immediately after Cheney gets this parry, he was of course moving forward, and Ben had explosively lunged forward in order to try to stab him, which meant that they got very close. And the reaction here and the timing is impeccable on the side of Steve here, because he immediately recognizes that he is too close to throw a follow-up cut and fully commits to a grapple. Now, when you are in this situation and you have just thrown a thrust and you got pushed off to somebody's left side, your right side, one of the most common options that people throw out of this is they simply pull off and they throw either a middle cut or like a Zverkow low underneath. And that's clearly what Ben was looking to go for here. But one of the common ways to dispel a low right Zverkow or a low middle cut is to push down on your opponent's hands with your hands and stuff that right opening. And that's what Cheney does. He gets both of his arms wrapped up in Ben's arms and waits for that little moment to pass where Ben clearly tries to throw a cut towards the arms or towards the body. He doesn't really get to either of them. And the second Cheney realizes that he has managed to stuff that Zverkow with both of his hands and his forward pressure, he then immediately transitions from the situation that he's in, disconnects his left hand, puts it over the top of both of Ben's arms, and then starts his grapple. Now, when he gets it over both arms, Ben manages to free his non-dominant hand, but is completely unable to free his sword and his dominant hand, which means he's pretty much cooked here. There's nothing he can do to pull out or pull away, and because Cheney has used his offhand to use his grapple, he does not have to free up his sword or his sword arm. He can simply raise it up above his head and just come down with a descending cut. Now, theoretically, Ben, who had managed to free his offhand, could have disconnected his own hand, gone for that counter grapple, and maybe ended up in a kind of neutral position, but it was a really, really quick turnaround. And one thing that I want to make clear here is if you're trying to get into grappling or grapple techniques like this, one of the most important factors is the person who realizes that you are in a grapple first is often the first person to start executing a grapple technique, and then the other person is stuck playing catch up. If you are in a grapple and you don't realize you're in one for even a quarter of a second, that's often more than enough time for your opponent to get a completely dominant position and then put you in a situation where there's nothing you can do, even once you realize that you are in the situation you are in. So if you want to get good at grappling, you have to be able to do the kind of transition that you see Cheney do here, where he takes that little bit of a quarter of a second with just forward pressure with just his hands to recognize whether or not he is fully in that grapple situation or not, and then instantly goes from that realization to an execution of a technique. So I'm going to skip 2 exchanges, partially because they're not particularly interesting, and partially because I've been talking for a while, and more importantly because I want to talk for a while about this particular exchange. Specifically, the parry riposte technique that Stephen Cheney throws after Ben throws his initial attack. So to go through the exchange real quick, Ben throws a little bit of a flicking middle how kind of thing towards Cheney's head. I believe that this was mostly intended to be a probing strike, one that was not heavily committed, because immediately after he throws this, he throws a follow-up that is low. Cheney, for the reference, does parry this flicking thrust and maybe over parries a little bit. And that might have been the intention behind Ben's initial probing strike. He wanted Cheney to overcommit to a bit of a parry and then throw something down low where he thought that he wasn't going to get riposted. But he did get riposted. But the very specific riposte that Stephen Cheney throws is a plunging shield howl from what I will basically just describe as a left ox position. Now, this is not a very common thing that you see people throw, and after watching this exchange, I think it should be a very common thing that people throw. Now, one of the issues with this particular parry that Stephen Cheney throws is he throws it with the flat side of his hand outward. Now, the issue with this particular kind of parry is that it basically punches the outside of your hand towards where the opponent's sword is coming from. And I don't know if this was intentional or not, but what really matters is that it acted as a perfect setup for the plunging cut that came later. And the idea here is that if you have confidence and you can throw the strong of your blade, and just the strong of your blade, into your opponent's cut, there's a pretty good chance you'll still be able to parry it. But if you want to throw this plunging shield howl afterwards, that flat thumb position on the inside of the guard is essential. Now, immediately upon feeling pressure on his guard, Stephen Cheney goes from his kind of high sword point in the air ox, simply tips his point down and drives it towards the left shoulder of Ben. And this is a really, really smart idea because 1, it reasserts the tip very quickly. 2, it can be used to be as a cut and a thrust, which means that if Ben had simply closed the distance, getting to a place where that tip was never going to be past its opponent, well, it doesn't matter, it's still a cut. And 3, it is a much better reposted option from some of the other options that people commonly do whenever they parry something on one side of their body. So real quickly, there is an idea here, which is, I've talked about in other videos, people have it in their brains to basically execute techniques in a left-right pattern. If they parry something on the left, their instinct is to then throw a technique on the right. And the reason for this is that whenever you parry something, most of the time your opponent is immediately going to go into parry mode themselves. Since they got parried, their sword is going to be on one side of their body, and if you throw a technique on the opposite side, well then they have to move their sword all the way from one side all the way to the other, and hopefully the time it takes for them to do so will be so much that your technique will land. Great, makes perfect sense. However, as I've also talked about before, there is a really great application of pattern recognition and breaking of patterns by simply parrying on one side and then throwing an attack on the same side. Now, normally, I would recommend a left zwerk in this situation. If you parry something on your upper left side, a left zwerk, or what is essentially a left duplirin at that point, becomes a really viable option because, 1, if your opponent goes into parry mode and they're used to this left-right mentality, they're going to shoot all the way to their bottom left, and they're not going to be there in time to take care of the left zwerk that is now coming towards the same side of their head. This is where you get situations where people start doing this with their sword. They're panicking, they know where they think they're supposed to be, but the person who is throwing their attack at them isn't conforming to that pattern, and their brain kind of breaks for a second. But in this particular execution, this shield howl, in my opinion, is a better execution of this same principle. The left Zwerk has a problem here in that it does not really close off any meaningful lines. If you've just parried something on your left side, what you have to rely on is your opponent moving from that position in order for your target to become open. And the reason that the plunging Shieldhau is a better option is that it actually comes through the center line, which is not currently occupied by your opponent's blade. So if we imagine a scenario where someone throws a cut, you parry it on your upper left side, if you throw that left Zwerk out and they don't leave, they can parry you very effectively. It relies on them thinking about the left, right thing to move from that space. But if you throw the plunging Shieldhau and they threw their attack and they got parried and they don't move, your Shieldhau comes along the other side. Because you have the inside line, because you have the dominant line in this parry, by reasserting the tip along that line, it is now on your opponent not only to try to parry your attempt, but also that if they go from their left side to their right side, they're still not going to make it in time to actually save themselves because this particular plunging Shieldhau goes onto the right side of the person who threw the attack, the left side of the person who's getting hit. It's almost a cheat code in that it's utilizing the benefits of the left-right pattern. It's utilizing the benefits of breaking the left-right pattern. And it gives you an option that is basically likely to succeed whether or not your opponent knows that the left-right pattern is getting broken or not. Regardless of which option they try to pick to try to bail themselves out of that situation, they don't have a good alternative. What they have to do is they actually have to wind up and into their left quadrant, which no one is going to think to do, because you have to push a little bit of pressure up and to the left in order to get that Shieldhau to miss your upper left shoulder opening. It's an ingenious parry riposte response that, sorry, I'm going to blow the whistle on here, everyone should be training and everyone should be doing. So if you want to try to apply this, these are the key points. When you parry on one side, and you can probably do this regardless of whether or not you parry with the flat of your blade or not, try throwing plunging Shieldhaus from left or right out of any high guarded attack. Anytime someone throws something at your head, and specifically your head, and you get that parry, try throwing that plunging Shieldhau, try reasserting that point. Make sure to throw the short edge down so that you get the cut, even if they jam you. And I think we have a really, really new, like a great application and a new meta breaking parry riposte. So hopefully I see a lot of people do it in your footage. Hopefully I get more things to review. And if you want to see another video like this, I will be here on Thursday.